Hey. Thank you everyone for being here with us today for the final session of the day. During this session, we're going to be exploring how diversity and inclusion can enhance success within an organization. And I want to give you a little warning that we are going to be using polling during this session. I think there was just a video about how you can do polling in your app, but do have it ready to go because we will be asking you to be interactive. Today, I'm joined by Inga Beale, the first female CEO in 328-year history of the insurance industry. Not only is she somebody who is an example of an authentic leader, but she's also had a wonderfully varied life experience, from taking a year off to go backpacking and cycling, to traveling the world with senior leadership roles, to playing competitive rugby within the Young London Wasps, and also establishing Pride of Lloyd's, and also the Dive In Festival, a celebration of diversity and inclusion. I'd like to remind you all that if you like the session, you can tweet it using the hashtag PLSA Annual 19, but also that you can ask questions not only through the app, but also we'll make time at the end after Inga speaks. We know within the pensions industry that we have a long way to go when it comes to diversity. For example, 8 out of 10 trustees are male, and we don't have enough ethnic minority and also disabled people represented within our industry. As we strive to reduce funding gaps, engage more members, and also to increase robustness of governance, possibly the missing piece of the puzzle is in actually having more diversity within our management teams. Research shows that companies are more successful if they actually consider diversity and inclusion. The Boston Consulting Group found that companies with a more diverse management team actually had 19% higher revenues. And this enhancement came from talent and ideas, from having a team that could be innovative, more customer-orientated and also enhancing engagement with customers, employee satisfaction and therefore productivity, and finally, more effective decision-making. All skills and all positive benefits that we could use within the pension industry. And we need to take responsibility as an industry to make a difference, not only within our own boards and our own management teams, but also within the companies that we invest in, making sure that we influence them in order to make them more diverse and inclusive. At the PLSA, we have been trying to lead by example, and we have set some targets within the conference in order to bring diversity to front of mind. We aim to have equal numbers from the speakers and the chairs of males and females. We also ran a survey with the speakers and the chairs in order to get some sort of feedback about how well we were doing. And we're just going to pop up some slides about how we did. So I can tell you now it wasn't easy. The team have really struggled in some areas because as an industry we do lack diversity, and this has a knock-on effect. So when we might have asked a woman to present, if she couldn't, she might put a peer in her place that would be a man. And that's to say little for the lack of minority representation, as mentioned before. So inside the numbers that we have this year, 107 speakers and chairs, 40 of which were women, which is about 37%. And this is more or less the same as last year. Now, I'm not a statistician, but Julian tells me that given the fact there were 20 more speakers this year, it's a huge achievement to keep that number approximately the same. At the same time, 64% of the speakers and the chairs who responded, 94% of them were white, and around 49% of them were under 45. And we can see the breakdown of age here. This is very impressive, and it's very much because the PLSA has been supporting bringing through new talent and diversity into the industry. And we know that that new talent that's coming through can be hugely beneficial to us in creating a more diverse thought program. Next Gen Now, of which I'm a part, is a fantastic example of the diverse group of talented young individuals who want to contribute to our industry. So, time to poll. Do I press next? Yes. Yes. Okay. Let's see whether or not the audience and the numbers that we have are representative. So, quick question of how old are you? Okay. So possibly the younger people have already started their night early, because I know they are waltzing around somewhere. But as you can see, I think this is quite representative of our industry. We are older in nature, and we have recognized that we possibly have a diversity issue, which is exactly why we're here to hear from somebody who has managed to affect change and also shine a light on best practice, thank God. So, Inga, tell us, how can we promote greater diversity and inclusion?
Thank you, thank you. So how many times have you felt you didn't belong somewhere? How often have you been in a situation where you were excluded from the main group or different to most of the other people there? And how did it make you feel? Well, I learnt quite early on to feel a bit like the odd one out. By the time I was 5, in fact, I felt a little like the odd one out. Now, this was because I had 2 siblings. I was the middle of 3 kids. I had a Norwegian mother, and my older brother and my younger sister managed to get that Scandinavian gene in them, and they were born with beautiful white blonde hair. I, believe it or not, in those days, was dark. I had dark brown hair. My brother and sister decided to tell me I was adopted because I looked so different to them. So from a very, very early age, I kind of thought I didn't belong in the family. And for many years through my life, I've been in lots of situations where I haven't felt I belonged. And I'm sure everyone in this room has been in one of those situations at some time. But we also know that there are a lot of people who have a feeling of being included much more than others. And we all have different upbringings, we all live somewhere where we might feel more included, we work, we go to school, we have all of these different factors. But I do remember then when I started work, and I was employed as a trainee underwriter at the Prudential back in 1982 in the City of London. And this was in the sort of face-to-face negotiating world. I was a treaty underwriter, so we were doing big deals. And I was one female underwriter out of 30, so me and 29 white men. And that was my sort of first experience of being different at work. And I so wanted to belong. I wanted to be one of them. I wanted to feel part of the team. And I think this is a really important aspect when we think about our workplaces. How are we going to make people feel included? When I was working there in the 80s, I was right next to the Lloyd's building. Now, the Lloyd's building to me was the most scary place on earth. It had only just accepted women into the building the decade before. So I started in 82, in 74 they'd allowed women in there. And yet it had been going for 300 odd years, basically as a male environment. So for me, I didn't feel I belonged there. So when 32 years later, I was appointed or approached about the CEO of Lloyd's role, I didn't believe they were serious. I couldn't for a moment imagine that they would appoint a woman to that role. I thought they were just putting a checklist on the hiring, oh, we've interviewed a woman. So I must admit, when I was first being interviewed, I was a bit nonchalant, I was a bit relaxed because I wasn't really thinking that it was serious. But then, as the interviews went on and suddenly I had to go in front of the PRA and the FCA, I thought, this is serious. Anyway, I did get the job and I was thrilled. I was over the moon. I could hardly believe that this young, petrified, lone woman in a man's world from the 80s was now running Lloyd's. It was a fantastic feeling. But then I started to read some of the media. Now, for those of you familiar with Lloyd's, Lloyd's used to be named, used to have lots of names in it. So all the investors who provided all the capital for all the underwriting at Lloyd's, they were called names. Now it's about 90%, over 90% corporate capital, and less than 10% of the capital is provided by names. But there was a lovely piece in one media, one newspaper, that said, the names will be turning in their graves at the news of me being appointed. Well, how do you think that made me feel? Wow. Well, actually, I suppose I had grown over the years very, very resilient to comments like that. So in a way, it made me even more determined to do well and to make the change happen at Lloyd's that I was being employed to do. But this chemistry of communication is an important element to consider, because it's real and it happens. People, when you feel in some way threatened or excluded, there's a chemical that gets released in your body. It's called cortisol. And it has a negative impact on you. So I could have reacted very badly to that negative comment, and I could have perhaps gone into retreat mode and felt that I needed to protect myself, because that's what happens. That chemical reaction in you shuts down the center thinking part of your brain. On the other hand, when something is said to you that makes you feel welcomed, included, it's a safe place, oxytocin is released. And that has the opposite effect. That makes you more creative. It makes you more innovative. It makes you want to collaborate and cooperate with more people. So doesn't it just make sense, on just knowing that at work, if we want to have more inclusive workplaces, we need to think about the language. Language matters. And also behaviours matter. And I can remember when I had been working for a while, I got my first promotion. And I was going to get my first company car, and I was really excited about it. And there was quite a nice list of cars. And I went, first of all, to the VW Audi garage. And I have to say, I didn't get a very welcoming response. It was a male salesman, and I think he made me feel as though I shouldn't even have been there, that I knew nothing about cars, that how could I possibly be there on my own looking for a car. So I left that garage, and then I went along to the Saab garage along the street. Now there I got a very different reaction. Another guy, another male salesman. He made me feel so welcome. He made me feel respected and valued. So what car did I get? I got a Saab. So these things matter to individuals. Now, you might say, well, how do we get to make our workplaces really, really inclusive? Now, I don't necessarily have the answer to that. But I will talk a bit later about one or two things I think we can do. But another question I get asked a lot is, why does it matter? Why does it matter? Surely you can't just be on this bandwagon or wanting to talk about this because of the social injustice in the world and to make it all nice and equal. There's got to be something else to it, hasn't there? There's got to be something more to it. Well, then I think about my time at Lloyd's. And I will take you back to the beginning of Lloyd's, to 1688. Lloyd's was formed in Edward Lloyd's coffee shop in the City of London. It would have been a very different place then. It was a street, it was Tower Street, it's called Great Tower Street now, and there were lots of merchants around there because it went down to the River Thames, and this is where all the ships used to come in with all of their cargoes. And Edward Lloyd, he wanted something special about his coffee shop, so he said, I'm going to specialise in maritime. I'm going to get all the latest shipping news for all the merchants and all the ship owners, and I'm going to give them the news. So it became this hub for the maritime trade. And then they realised the seas were very treacherous, and they said, well, you know, my ship might be lost at sea, they might be attacked by pirates. Let's start sharing the risk. So that was where they started to share the risk and sort of do the original crowdfunding, or the original names started to come in, put money towards pooling the risk. And in those days, if you wanted to participate on a risk and obviously take some of the premium but share in if there was an event, bad event, you would write your name, underwrite your name. And you would write your name and how much of that risk you were going to take. In 2013, 325 years later, business was still done the same way. Amazing. So I was brought in to modernize and introduce technology to fundamentally a place that had not changed for centuries. And I thought about this, and I didn't really know how we were going to do it. I know that there'd been failed attempts over decades. But one of the things I realized was that there was no diversity in the market. And when I looked out and I walked through the active trading room, I hardly saw anyone with any ethnic diversity. I hardly saw any females. And I thought there's something to this. We need, if we want to be successful, and it applies, I believe, to any business, we want to be successful, we want to move forward, it means we've got to continue to be innovative. That means we've got to get different people around the table. We've got to employ new types of people to have the new ideas. So that's when I started to get very, very interested in trying to drive a more diverse and inclusive marketplace. It wasn't that I thought when I arrived that's what I needed to do. I realized I needed to do it because it was the way we were going to make change happen and make sure that Lloyd's could join the current century and actually embrace technology and start thinking in a modern way. And the reason I think about this, it's so important because we need to have sustainable businesses. We need to attract the best talent. We used to do a lot of work with the schools. We'd get the young kids coming in from neighbouring boroughs in London. We'd have them they'd come in a visit. And because it was a physical trading room, there was a lot happening. And I remember being in there once, and there was a 7-year-old boy, and he said, "Oh, why is everybody wearing a school uniform?" So to him, by the age of 7, it was already a place he didn't want to be. So we've got to think about this and create places that are much more modern, dynamic, interesting for people to come if we want to make sure our whole financial services sector moves forward and doesn't get left behind. We need to attract the tech-savvy people. And when I think about the impact that we can have if we do that on broader society, I think there's a much more meaningful thing behind this. The wealth gap is getting larger. We know that millions of people have been moved out of poverty over the last decades, but we also know that 26 people in the world have as much wealth as 3.8 billion. So we know that there's a huge wealth gap there. And when I think about how this manifests itself in the workplace, where does it start? The workplace has a lot to do with it. Out of the ethnic makeup of the UK, 14% are from ethnic minorities. And yet when you look at the positions of influence and power in the UK, only 3% of those positions are held by ethnic minorities. There are more men called Steve and Dave who run companies in the FTSE 350 than there are female CEOs. If I look at insurance, there are less than 5% female leaders in the executive teams within the insurance sector, which is way behind the rest of the FTSE, which is now over 20%. Now, I've given my life over to insurance, and I want to make sure insurance and all the related activities connected with financial services and looking after people's money stay relevant and stay modern. So this is why I personally become so passionate about it. There's a real business reason why we need to do this. So we need to get out there, we need to start talking about it, we need to understand differences, we need to understand that it takes actually a bit more time to have some more diversity. We need to understand that we have to set some targets and mean business. We need to upskill and train people. I fell into the trap when I was a young manager in the 90s. One of the brokers was coming in to visit me, and he said, "Oh, Inga, I got the short straw today." I said, "What do you mean, the short straw?" He said, "Well, I had to come in and see the Spice Girls, and I know from the age demographic here, most of you remember who the Spice Girls are. He said, I'm coming in to see the Spice Girls. And of course, I looked around, and I'd got 5 female underwriters. And I thought, how did I manage that? I was not skilled or trained in being a diverse and inclusive manager. It had happened. I'd hired people who were like me, who looked like me, who spoke like me. We got on together. We liked doing the same things. That's what I'd end up hiring. And I'd realised I'd lost all the men. And you might say, how could she have been so stupid not to notice? Well, these things happen. And unless we challenge ourselves and understand that we have these biases, that we have to actually make that extra bit of effort to be inclusive and diverse, we won't make a difference. But if we can do it, and we do it thoughtfully and collectively, I believe we can have a massive impact, not just on making sure that all of our businesses thrive well into the future, but that we can have a far-reaching positive impact on society. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm now going to take some questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So we do have some roaming mics, and while people are just thinking, maybe I'll kick off with one question. Okay, so this one's an interesting question because you've just mentioned talent and bringing through talent. This question says, do the benefits of diversity outweigh the risk of lowering standards to accommodate weaker but diverse applicants?
Very interesting, because I get asked that a lot, and I think, why does someone think that because you're a woman or because you're from a different ethnic background, you might not be as good at the job? To me, that implies that you might have slightly sexist or racist feelings. So I know this is a complex one, and this comes up a lot, but to me, there's an automatic assumption that anyone who isn't the norm, the majority, is going to be less capable of doing a job. And I think that's why I feel uncomfortable with that, because I think it needs exploring, because there's something behind it where someone's saying, gosh, you're not going to be as good. And I wonder about this a lot. When I worked at GE, I was fortunate enough, after the Pru, I worked at GE, a big American conglomerate, still in the insurance sector, and I was part of a target. So my manager, and this was in the 90s, mid-90s, GE was very proactive in its talent management. My manager was asked to promote women and ethnic minorities as part of the talent management of GE. And when he came up to me to offer me my first promotion, I'd been working for 12 years, so I wasn't a fast track, high flyer or anything. I said no to the promotion because I didn't feel able to do it. I wasn't confident enough. But because I was going to impact his bonus, he surrounded me by the support and help I needed to have the confidence to take that job. Now, I would now challenge how, if I'd worked somewhere else, whether I would ever have achieved getting the CEO of Lloyd. And that's why I have a slight issue with
that's a good answer.
What's behind that.
So possibly quotas, while they're not great, they could create some change in thought processes that could have a positive impact.
Yeah, because we've got so much, there's a lot of complexity around this topic, and something that's measurable and we can aim for. I think there's something here.
Hi, is this on? Yeah. Hi, Rebecca Jones from New Money. I wonder, Inga, if you have any thoughts on the one thing, perhaps, or one or two things that the finance industry could do to encourage more women in. I have my own ideas, but I'd like to hear yours.
Yeah, well, I think generally people will say that when they hire, it's fairly gender balanced. But then they tend to lose women in particular. If we're thinking about women, just on that theme or that stream of diversity, then we know that we lose women. Now, I know that women and men behave differently. And I know from speaking to some of the young grads that came into the Lloyd's market, that some of them said within 2 or 3 years, I don't want to stay here. I can't hack the behaviours. Now, I asked, what is this? Well, it's just the the comments, the odd little bit of banter. It's such a difficult topic to unpick, but there are behaviours that mean that some people feel, oh, I'll just leave. It's much easier, I'll go and work somewhere else. So that's one thing. The other thing is, of course, you've got to change all your policies and practices to make sure they're balanced. And what I'm really keen to do these days is to talk much more about equality and balance. Now, I used to be a bit more strident, and it used to be, about, women, and we've got to do this, and we've got to have targets for women. But I've learned that actually we're alienating people who are different to us, and that isn't the point of inclusion. We're meant to be having conversations with people who are not like us so we can understand. So we've got to think about balance. And when I signed up Lloyd's to the Women in Financial Services Charter, you're meant to have a commitment to have a target for senior leadership positions filled by women. And I said, well, how am I going to set this target? Well, I learnt from the Luxembourg Prime Minister. When he got into power in Parliament, he said, I'm going to set myself a target of at least 30% men, at least 30% women in my Parliament. And that's what I did for Lloyd's, only I chose 40%. Because I said, you shouldn't be able to argue with a nice balanced target like that, which is equal. And that's what I think we've got to try and get to. I don't know all the reasons how we get more women particularly to stay in financial services. It's a topic that we could probably talk about for days.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned something about the culture, because I think that's really, really important. I am a journalist now, but I used to work for an investment firm, and the laddie culture that goes on those desks is really quite toxic. Although it's quite interesting once you do find a woman come into that environment, it tends to actually settle down, and the men prefer working there themselves because they don't feel they have to, contribute to this kind of laddie culture. But that seems to me to be a really difficult nut to crack.
It is. The behaviours, the actual behaviours are very difficult. And of course, there's so much in society. And there is something about going into the workplace and being, I don't know, with a tribe. You sort of get these tribal behaviours. I mean, I think we've seen some of this, the dreadful behaviour at football matches recently with the racism and the homophobia and things like that. And there is the element that sort of, when you're all a tribe together and you don't have all these diverse people in it, it can lead to some very poor behaviours. And in Lloyd's, the trading room, we have boxes, as we call them, where the underwriters sit. They're desks, actually, but they're still called boxes. And the brokers would come and see the underwriters. And I'm afraid even 3-4 years ago, the women were often still called box bitches and box bunnies. So you can just imagine, if you're called that a few times, why are you going to want to stay? And that's what we've got to try and crack down. But it's a very difficult one, very difficult.
John?
John Dambitz, hi. Inga, this isn't directed at you, but I'd like your view on the notion that women who have succeeded, who are at the top of their game, are then throwing barriers to other women to succeed them. So they're not encouraging the inclusion, they're actually pushing away. And Maggie Thatcher is one that came to mind.
Yes. Madeleine Albright's, I think it was her who said, any woman who doesn't bring up other women deserves a place in hell. I found that some sectors are a bit more like that, where they haven't grouped themselves together. Now, in the insurance sector, 11 years ago, we formed the Insurance Supper Club, a bunch of C-suite women, and we didn't really know why we were doing it. We didn't really have a vision, but we thought we've got to get together and talk about this. And we have found that we've got hundreds of women now, and we've managed to create a very supportive environment. But I also know I've spoken to some female lawyers who say they don't have that at all. It doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel supportive. So I think there's something to be said for encouraging these networks to form. Doesn't mean you always just speak to each other, but it provides a nice, safe, supportive environment. Because we have to help each other. But I also think it's a collective responsibility. We've got to do this. I remember when Emma Watson did her United Nations He for She launch, and she asked for men to join in and say, what are you going to pledge? Well, how are you going to commit to make a difference, a positive difference to a girl or a woman's life? And I looked on the website, this was 5 years later, I looked on the website recently, and there were 2.1 million pledges on there, which initially I thought that was great, and then I thought, gosh, how many billions of people have we got in the world? Maybe it isn't so great. But it's probably we need to move on from a he for she, and it's more like a we for she we now need, because we need to get the women as equally responsible for helping other women.
Okay, we're very short on time, but I know that there's one question at the top, and we'll just finish with the one down here quickly if we can.
Yes, Craig Rimmer from the PLSA. I was wondering if there was more that needed to be done in terms of our schools and encouraging diversity in the schools, in terms of that inclusiveness, that idea that we all belong, and, you know, in that aspect, and to hear your views on that.
I do think, and these days with social media and the internet, children have access to so many things out there. So I believe they are learning about life much earlier than perhaps I did when I was growing up. And schools will have an important part to play. Now, I know that schools they often have programs where parents or people that they know will come in and talk about their careers and things. I think every parent can actually make sure that their school is covering all the spectrum, men and women, showing all, you know, that everyone can do everything. And we've got to start really, really early. I've had I've not had children myself, but I've had several conversations with people that say, by the age of 12, they're already, girls, boys, they're all looking at their role models, and they're seeing who they should be emulating. And I'm afraid they're not necessarily the role models that lead to a more inclusive world. So I think absolutely it starts at school. Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to run out of time, but one of the questions here I think we should absolutely end on. It says, what is the one thing that employers can do in order to affect diversity or create change? So is there one thing that you think that everyone could go away and do?
It's so difficult to come up with one answer, with one thing. But it's got to start from the top. So I'm going to, you know, be a little cheeky here and not just give one answer. It's got to start from the top. So you've got to mean it. You've got to communicate it, and you've got to really mean it. I think you've got to change your policies and practices to make sure they're as equal and inclusive for all. Measure where you can, get the data out there, and then start exploring the root causes about why people are leaving. And important, I think, to start having conversations. The number of enlightening conversations I have when I have a conversation with somebody not like me, it opens up my mind to be much more inclusive to others. And I think we can all have a part to play in that.
Perfect, thank you. So go away and evaluate your boards and your teams by the sounds of it, but also have some conversations. Thank you very much, Inga.
Thank you.